On the 3rd of May 1945, the Hawker Typhoons of 83 Group, 2nd Tactical Air Force, were tasked with attacking shipping in Lubeck Bay on Germany's northern Baltic coast. From noon, Typhoons entered Lubeck Bay and found their targets, two large ships of around 12,000 and 8,000 tons, as well as two smaller ones. Armed with RP-3 rockets with 60-pound warheads and 20mm cannons, the Typhoons swooped in, and they met little resistance. The attack left the SS Cap Arcona, a former luxury liner, and the freighter Tailbeck burning and sinking. On board both ships were thousands of concentration camp victims who had been evacuated from the Neuengamme concentration camp south of Hamburg. 83 Group's Typhoons would return throughout the afternoon and also sink the former liner SS Deutschland, which was in the process of being converted to a hospital ship. The exact death toll is unknown, but it has been estimated that well over 7,000 were killed in the icy waters of Lubeck Bay, mere hours before the town of Lubeck itself was captured by the 11th Armoured Division. As we get started, I just wanted to make clear the main sources for this video. The primary source is Dr. Daniel Long's PhD thesis entitled A Disaster in Lubeck Bay, an analysis of the tragic sinking of the Cap Arcona, 3rd of May 1945. Volumes 3 and 4 of Thomas and Shore's 2nd Tactical Air Force, Sea of Death, the Baltic 1945 by Claes-Goran and Wetterholm, Survivor by Sam Pivnik, and The Last Survivor by Frank Krake about his friend Bim Aloserij. So how did the RAF end up attacking ships crammed with concentration camp prisoners in the final hours of the Second World War? Well, it was an intelligence failure that saw the vital information not passed on to the men who would plan and carry out the attack. While you might expect the final days of the war in Northwest Europe to see a winding down of efforts, the opposite is true. 2 TAF's 83 Group had been tasked with supporting 21st Army Group since the Normandy landings, and by May 1945 they were racing to keep pace with the advance. 83 Group's Typhoons had been leapfrogging forward to captured air bases to ensure they could stay within range of the front line, and as the Rhineland campaign wore down, 2 TAF were not going to take their boot off the Nazis' neck. The SS Cap Arcona was one of the great luxury liners of the interwar era. She was the flagship of the Hamburg Süd Line, plying her trade on the Europe to South America route. Built by Böhm & Voss in Hamburg and launched on the 14th of May 1927, her nearly 500 crew members would care for her 1,300 passengers, including 575 in first class, in the very finest of luxury. With restaurants, a heated pool, ballrooms and a cinema, even a tennis court, her passengers had plenty to do while they went to and from South America. When war broke out, Cap Arcona was requisitioned by the Kriegsmarine, where she became an accommodation ship, and even a stand-in for the Titanic in the Nazi film of the ship sinking, which is a wild tale in itself, in which Goebbels ends up imprisoning the original director, Herbert Selpin, who was then found dead in his cell hanging from his suspenders. In January 1945, Cap Arcona joined Operation Hannibal, which was the evacuation of Germans from East Prussia. Cap Arcona would survive the prowling Soviet submarines in those hellish Baltic waters that would claim, among other ships, the Wilhelm Gustloff and over 9,000 lives. Cap Arcona would transport over 25,000 German troops and civilians west before, now in a pitiful condition, she would find herself in Lubeck Bay. Neuengamme concentration camp was established in 1938 as a sub-camp of Sachsenhausen. By the 19th of April 1945, when the SS ordered the camp evacuated, the camp had had over 100,000 inmates, and around half had died. Between the 22nd and 26th of April, some 6,000 prisoners were loaded onto cattle trucks and were sent north to Lubeck, where they were loaded onto the waiting ships. Chaos awaited them in Lubeck as the number of prisoners overwhelmed the port. By the end of April 1945, around 9,000 prisoners would be loaded aboard the Cap Arcona, the Tailbeck, and the motor launch Athens in Lubeck Bay. Conditions aboard the Cap Arcona were terrible. The ship's chief steward, Fritz Schwartz, would remember the prisoners boarding his ship. He said they were living dead who stumbled on board Cap Arcona, dressed in rags or prison clothing, walking uncertainly along the gangway. They streamed on board in hundreds. On board were prisoners of many nationalities, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, political prisoners, all those who the Nazis had tried to exterminate. As the days passed, rations ran out. The gangways of Cap Arcona began to fill with the dead. Aboard the bulk freighter Tailbeck, where over 2,000 prisoners were crammed in her hold with little or no food or water, the bilges filled with human waste and the dead. The British, in the meantime, were closing in on Lubeck, and as the battlefront collapsed, more and more aircraft from multiple air forces were hunting in an ever-decreasing area. With the identification between civilians, Swedish Red Cross white buses, and military targets becoming ever more difficult due to the vast numbers of refugees fleeing west from the Soviets, mistakes were made. On the evening of the 8th of April 1945, US aircraft attacked the marshalling yards at Celle in Prussian Hanover. The trains there were carrying concentration camp prisoners en route to Bergen-Belsen. The results of the attack, and then the massacre by the SS that followed, claimed the lives of over 3,000 internees. Into this mix were thrown two Taft's Typhoon wings. As they had moved forward, communication lines were stretched, and rumours of a German escape to Norway abounded. The sortie count and the amount of ammunition expended in May 1945 alone is staggering. From the 1st through the 5th, when hostilities ceased, 83 Group alone flew 2,882 sorties and fired over 5,000 rockets and dropped over 600 bombs. 83 Group's headquarters also moved forward 3 times in April, and in early May, they were preparing to move again. Coupled with this, intelligence sorties by the photo reconnaissance units over German ports were limited due to poor weather, therefore increasing the lack of information over the potential targets in the port. As 11th Armoured under Major General Pip Roberts approached Lubeck, he was contacted by the Swedish Red Cross representative Dr. Hans Arnoldsson, who advised Roberts and his command that the ships in Lubeck Bay contained concentration camp prisoners. Roberts' men passed this intel up the chain, where it did reach to Taft. Later in 1945, a war crimes investigation was carried out by the British under a Major N.O. Till, and that reported that the intelligence officer with 83rd Group, RAF, has admitted on 2 occasions that a message was received on the 2nd of May 1945 that these ships were loaded with KZ prisoners, but that, although there was ample time to warn the pilots of the planes who attacked those ships on the following day, by some oversight, the message was never passed on. The name of the intelligence officer is not currently known. The interview transcript is currently misfiled in the archives at Kew and is yet to be located. As such, Cap Arcona and the other ships in the bay's fate were sealed. In these dying days of the war, the build-up of shipping in Lubeck, Kiel and the other Baltic ports had been spotted, and 2 TAF, along with the other commands, were attacking every port. On the 3rd of May 1945, when the Typhoons arrived above Lubeck Bay, they found what we would call today a target-rich environment, with 4 large ships at anchor. Flak was sporadic, which means that even with the usually inaccurate RP-3 rockets and bombs, the Typhoon pilots would have large and stationary targets to attack, meaning that they could do so without having to make avoidance for anti-aircraft fire. Just after noon, 4 Typhoons of 184 Squadron arrived from B-111 to the southwest of Bremen. The squadron had already put up 19 individual sorties that day. They singled out the Deutschland, which was being converted to a hospital ship, but had yet to have more than 1 Red Cross painted on it. They fired 32 rockets at her, scoring 4 hits, but a couple of the warheads didn't detonate and were thrown over the side. Fires were quickly started, but also quickly put out, and the Deutschland skipper, Captain Stenke, prepared his crew for a quick departure. They also tried hanging white sheets from the masts. Next, 189 Squadron arrived at around 3 p.m., led by Group Captain Johnny Baldwin. Baldwin was the highest-scoring Typhoon ace of the war and was known as a highly reliable commander, having been tasked numerous times with attacking difficult targets, which he had done so with success. On the 3rd of May, he was also leading his old squadron, which he'd commanded in 1943 and 44. 198 split their attack, with 5 Typhoons going after Cap Arcona and 5 going after the tailbay. Cap Arcona was still painted in her naval grey. 198 would claim all 40 of the rockets that they fired would hit the liner. The survey of the ship in June 1945 would prove just how proficient 198 were with their rockets, as most had found their targets. Cap Arcona was struck between her funnels, which saw the rockets exploding within the accommodation area of the ship. She was left burning, with the squadron reporting that many bodies seen abandoning ship. The 4 Typhoons attacking the tailback, lying about 750 yards off of the Cap Arcona, scored hits below the waterline of the freighter, which began taking on water and listing to starboard and beginning to smoke. Within 45 minutes, she sinks, with an estimated 2,800 people trapped in her holds, of which only 50 survived. On board Cap Arcona, Fires are breaking out everywhere, and her crew, with failing firefighting equipment, are unable to control them. As they fight the fires, 8 Typhoons of 193 Squadron arrive overhead. They're loaded with 2 500-pound bombs each. One of the pilots, Flight Lieutenant David Ince, would recall in an oral interview with the Imperial War Museum that we carried out dive bombing attacks on each occasion, and with varying success. But we certainly left from the 3 shipping strikes a total, I think, of 3 ships on fire, damaged or listing, and obviously of no further use for these alleged German northbound convoys. The attacks would continue in the evening as 263 Squadron, followed by 197 Squadron, attacked the ships. All squadrons recorded hits on the ships. 263's rockets start fires on Deutschland that are then exacerbated by 197's bombs. The crew of the Deutschland frantically waved white sheets to signal the fighters who couldn't make out what they were trying to do. Deutschland begins to burn and the crew abandon her. She sinks 4 hours later. Aboard Cap Arcona, chaos reigns. There's an American on board named Philip Jackson. He remembered that most of the people on the Cap Arcona were burned or drowned. I saw the deck black with people who did not jump. I also saw some people swimming. There was naturally no question of lowering boats as the ship was blazing in such a way. Sam Pivnik, a Jew who had survived Auschwitz and Dora Mittelbau before finding himself aboard the Cap Arcona, remembered in his memoir that people were running in all directions over the deck, and thick grey smoke was belching from the area below. Pivnik dived into the icy Baltic, only to find the struggle to get onto something that floated. He said, as I reached it, my frozen hands grabbed someone else's, and another half-dead prisoner got there just as I did. We probably both had the same idea, to forget all thoughts of humanity and to kick the other bastard away. The other men in the water around us were doing just that, fighting and screaming at each other in a desperate quest for survival. In November 2017, the Aloserij gave the following remembrance to the Husum-Schwessing concentration camp memorial.
There was a huge panic. I ran outside. I thought, either I jump into the sea or I burn to death. I went to the railing thinking it must be some 15 meters high. I'm not fit, I'll not make it. But I wanted off the ship. Then I saw a rope hanging. I got undressed and used the rope to get down to the sea. It was very cold, I think 8 degrees. It had been a hard winter. But what now? About 8 meters away, I saw an inflatable boat with nobody on it. So I swam over to it, and another person climbed up into it, with a shaven head and gaunt face. A prisoner. We then brought on board a few prisoners who were drifting further away, and together we reached the coast.
As the Typhoons headed for home, the SS returned in boats to rescue their men and the crews. They executed survivors in the water and those who'd made it to the beach. They did this even though 11th Armour was in Lübeck itself and was assaulting the port. The freighter Athens was even hit by a 17-pounder from 11th Armoured as they tried to return to the quay. The crew and the SS on board made their escape but left the prisoners locked in the hold. 2.5 hours after the attack on the Cap Arcona, the remainder of her fuel exploded. She rolled onto her port side and settled, half submerged on the seabed. By the end of the 3rd of May 1945, survivors were beginning to make it ashore. Lubeck was in British hands. The Typhoons were being serviced ahead of their last day of combat, and the bodies were washing up all along the coast of Lubeck Bay. Before the investigations could start, the bodies needed to be buried. Mass graves were dug and the victims of the SS and the RAF were buried in the sandy soil with full military honours. Again, the exact number of the dead is unknown, with estimates varying from 7,000 to 9,000 across the 4 ships that were in the bay that day. There's been much speculation over cover-ups and what the RAF knew. From Daniel Long's research, we can see that the vital piece of intelligence was not passed to the planners, who had been ordered to step up the pressure across the front and at sea in the final days of the war. For 83 Group, this meant that they completed the strike in Lubeck Bay very successfully, but also very tragically. Why this information wasn't passed on is currently a mystery until the transcript of that interview with the intelligence officer is found in the archives. At best, it's the case of a harried intelligence officer constantly on the move who missed passing on the information about the ships containing concentration camp prisoners while focusing on something else. At worst, it was malice, but that was not shown in the report by Major Till. One thing that we do know is that this tragedy does not fit the narrative of VE Day. The attack on the Cap Arcona, Deutschland, Tailbeck and Athens does not fit the victory that is remembered and celebrated. For modern historians, especially of the British exceptionalist bent that we're seeing so much on the rise today, that doesn't fit. And if you pick up almost any history book of the dying days of the war in Northwest Europe, the Cap Arcona is a sentence, a paragraph, maybe a footnote. While the fires were burning in the bay, a delegation arrived from Donetsk at Montgomery's HQ. Within 24 hours, the documents of surrender were signed, and in 36 hours, the war in Northwest Europe was over. The sinking of the Cap Arcona and Tailbeck was a tragedy in a war that redefined the word. Many have explained the sinkings away due to the fog of war. In reality, we should call this exactly what it was: a colossal cock-up. 80 years on, it is right to remember those who died in the freezing waters of Lubeck Bay at the hands of those who were moments away from rescuing them. Thank you for watching.